An obvious case where female learning leads to a somewhat unfortunate end is Abelard and Eloise. And I'm wondering, in the later period, in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, whether that was brought up as an argument against female learning.
Thank you for the question. Concerning the first remark on natural magic and Schumann, well, I think this is also, I thought it was a bit strange, at least, to refer to magic in this very positive sense. You might be right that she refers to this conception that we find also in Bacon about just the hidden qualities of things that could be detected by rational means. But she's also referring here to Cardano, and I don't know if Germana is still here, then she maybe could comment on this in more detail. But Cardano in his Del Senso, he's also obviously saying that he's just relating here to natural magic. But what he then comes up with is, to our minds, really wild, and not something that we would agree all on, that this is something that is, you know, rational in the most basic sense. So there is the idea that there are a lot of, you know, demons around, spirits everywhere that come in. We can communicate with them. They can communicate with our emotions without us knowing. So there are a lot of impulses and I think his book was also on the index. So it was, and she cites it. So she said Cardano. So yeah. What
about, what's his name, the other big magic?
Which one?
Late 16th century. I'm forgetting the name, the other large book about natural magic.
Della Porta.
Della Porta, yeah. Yes. Does she mention him?
No, she does not.
Interesting.
No, yeah. And concerning Abelard and Eloise, that's interesting. No, I haven't come across this. So the idea that female learning might be disastrous, especially for women's chastity and for her moralities, and well, this was a commonplace. For instance, Isotta Nogarola, who was a very learned and famous Italian humanist, she had to face all these attacks, anonymously written and published pamphlet against her, where they state, well, that she had all kinds of, they just, you know, said she would have all these kinds of sexual relationship with other people, because until now there is no woman who is eloquent and chaste. All the women who try to say something in public, they are mischievous and they are kind of morally corrupt, and that's why she's also the case. So this was very common, but as far as I remember, Abelard and Eloise don't come up in this context.
Yes, same type of question for Sabrina Ebersmeyer. There's also a very interesting, from the 17th and 18th century, a theater tradition of representing curious women, or femmes savantes, because in a way, if you look at Molière's play Les Femmes Savantes, it's really the femme curieuse. It's misplaced kind of curiosity and the role of women in science, up to Goldoni in the 18th century, mid-18th century, his play called The Curious Woman, a femme curieuse. I don't know the title in English, but I guess in Italian, I suppose it's exactly the same. So there's also the representation, the theater representation of curiosity in women, mid-17th century to the late 18th century, and it's always connected to science. A woman who get into science as a form of curiosity calls for disaster in these two plays, basically. Yeah.
Well, Kenny is relating to this tradition in more detail. I think it's more also in his realm of research. Yeah, that's true. but this would always reinforce the assumption, which is obviously true for a greater part of our tradition, that there was this mockery and this negative approach to female curiosity, and people who try to say that, make it look like something very ridiculous and that should be avoided by serious women. So that's why I decided to put my attention on the writings of women to see if they could express some alternative perspective on the issue, as just always reiterating the same old prejudice that come actually from antiquity and lived all the time up to the 19th century, 20th maybe, 21st, I don't know.
Merci. J'ai une question pour Thierry Grantier, mais je voudrais d'abord poser une question à Madame. Est-ce que la curiosité des femmes s'étend jusqu'à se demander pourquoi leur honneur serait lié à la chasteté? Est-ce qu'elles mettent en question cette loi? Sorry. I'll put the same question in English. Now, does female curiosity extend to questioning the link between chastity and the honor of women? Why, after all, why should it be a dishonor for women to lose their chastity? Do you find in women's writing any questioning of that law?
Why people believe?
Not,
why the question?
And if not, sorry.
The question.
Can I complete my question? Yeah. And if not, I will provide a male writer who does question that law.
Ah, great. So I'm curious to hear your response. The prejudice goes back very far. We find it already in Aristotle, the idea that women should be quiet outside the house. We find it also in the Bible as a precept, how women should have to behave. I don't know why, I think the reason behind why it was kept with this persistence was because it is an argument of power, which keeps a power structure. But I'm not sure, when it was questioned for the first time, but then probably you have an answer there.
Well, I don't know if my author, who of course is Pierre Bayle, is the first one to question that law. But he does explicitly say that the linking of women's honor to chastity is a tour de force of male pride. And that's the only reason why women's honor is linked to chastity.
Of male pride?
Yeah, pride.
Pride.
Pride,
Yeah.
So late 17th century.
Yeah. So as I quoted Christine de Pizan, which is she's earlier, and she she doesn't give an explanation in this sense that it might be pride, but she said there are certain interests behind why men talk like this, and the same is true for the other authors, and especially in Arcangela Tarabotti, who is very much shows that it is the interests especially by fathers, to keep their daughters inside to save money, to save.
Yes, not quite. I mean, you had a quotation suggesting that, ridiculing the idea that since women will frequent schools, they will probably lose their chastity.
Yeah.
But he didn't go so far as to say, so what?
Yeah, that's true.
Right.
That's true. Yeah. I can't see that. I can't come across a woman who would justify unchastity.
Not at that period, anyway.
Yeah, not in this period.
Pour Thierry, oui, il y a un essai célèbre de Bacon sur la superstition, n'est-ce pas, par rapport à l'athéisme, où il a une formule célèbre par rapport à l'athéisme, que l'athéisme est après tout préférable à la superstition. Mais en même temps, comme tu l'as souligné, la foi est posée comme une limite de définition presque de la curiosité légitime, n'est-ce pas? Quelle différence est-ce qu'il fait exactement entre l'acte de foi orthodoxe, disons, et l'acte de foi superstitieuse?
C'est pas une question très facile. La distinction entre l'athéisme et la superstition, il la reprend aussi dans l'Advancement of Learning. Il dit qu'au fond, Dieu est moins insulté si on ne croit pas en lui que si on croit des choses fausses de lui. Mais j'ai jamais pensé à ce que ça pouvait avoir comme conséquence épistémologique. Il me semble que se faire une fausse conception ou rechercher les fins divines est nuisible à la science de toutes les façons. À la limite, ne pas croire en Dieu est peut-être moins nuisible en quelque façon. Maintenant, est-ce que... moi, je regarde toute la partie qu'il y a sur la théologie à la fin de l'Advancement. Il n'est pas tellement question de théologie orthodoxe et hétérodoxe. Il y a bien quelque chose d'un peu protestant qui anime tout ça, mais je ne pourrais pas dire qu'il fasse une apologie de la religion chrétienne en tant que telle. Ça me semble où il faudrait vraiment relire les textes là, pour ça. Ce qui est assez clair chez lui, hein, il compare bien avant Carl Schmitt et bien avant même Leibniz, le droit, la théologie et le jeu d'échecs. Il dit que ce sont des rationalités qui ne s'opèrent que sur une donnée que nous ne déduisons pas. Dans le jeu d'échecs, il faut accepter les règles du jeu d'échecs. Dans le droit, il faut accepter les lois positives. Et dans la théologie, il faut accepter la loi divine. Voilà, c'est plutôt une question de structure, j'ai l'impression, chez lui.
Ma question était motivée justement parce que on avait l'air de se heurter à une autorité qui interdisait d'aller plus loin, n'est-ce pas? On pourrait comprendre s'il y avait des raisons, si la foi, après tout, était fondée sur des preuves de l'existence de Dieu et de sa révélation. Mais imposer l'autorité de l'Écriture sans raison, est-ce que ce n'est pas là précisément la définition de la superstition?
Oui. Je pense qu'il faut recontextualiser la problématique de Bacon, tout simplement. Et ce qu'il veut éviter, c'est, encore une fois, c'est surtout la recherche des causes finales. Les gens qui veulent scruter, ils parlent toujours du mélange de théologie et de philosophie naturelle. C'est là qu'il est le plus... c'est ce qui motive vraiment son affaire. Il n'est pas dans un contexte... Je crois que c'est important parce que beaucoup de choses qu'on voit chez Bacon, on les voit aussi chez Montaigne et chez Hobbes, mais dans des contextes très différents. Ils sont dans des guerres confessionnelles. Bacon vit dans cette période de stabilité relative. Il y a des textes où il défend Jacques Ier contre les ultramontains, etc. Mais finalement, il n'a pas à discuter tellement, voilà, quelle est la bonne théologie et quelle est la mauvaise. En tout cas, il me semble pas. Ce qu'il ne veut pas, c'est le mélange de théologie et de science. Je pense que c'est là-dessus, en tout cas, qu'il faut se fonder pour... au fond, peu importerait que ce soit la foi musulmane ou une autre foi. Ça ne gênerait pas plus les sciences. En tout cas, du point de vue strict de l'avancée du progrès scientifique, simplement, il faut qu'à un moment, il dit, même le terme de plaquette, je trouve que, je ne sais pas si c'est très employé, voilà, il faut accepter un arbitraire divin, un dire arbitraire de Dieu, c'est comme ça et c'est pas autrement. Et on retrouvera ça évidemment chez Hobbes, on le trouvait chez Montaigne, chez Hobbes, mais dans des contextes très différents, puisque les deux étaient quand même dans des contextes de guerre confessionnelle.
Oui, pour Thierry Gontier aussi, il semble que Bacon fait une identification entre spéculation et une recherche fondée sur les causes finales. Est-ce qu'il, selon ce que j'ai compris, peut-être j'ai raté des choses, mais est-ce qu'il différencie entre recherche fondée sur cause finale et recherche fondée sur une cause formelle ou cause matérielle, comme par exemple Dieu comme première cause, et ou est-ce que une telle recherche aussi serait nous limitée encore par les idoles créées par nous-mêmes?
Je crois que ce sont deux choses un peu différentes quand même. La spéculation telle que la critique Bacon, c'est simplement le désir de jouir de... C'est sur un autre plan que la recherche des causes. C'est le désir de jouir de la vision, de la connaissance, quoi, de jouir de la connaissance. Exactement ce que pense tout bon aristotélicien, qu'on jouit véritablement et que cette jouissance, qui a un bonheur, procure aussi un plaisir. Et c'est dévalorisé en tant que forme d'hédonisme. Hein. Mais ça n'interfère pas, je pense, avec sa critique des recherches des causes finales, qui est une sorte de critique d'une recherche qui est anxieuse. Hein. Il emploie très peu le terme curiosité, mais il emploie beaucoup d'autres termes, subtilité. Bon, et finalement, il y a quand même un réseau sémantique qui permet de se faire une idée de ce qu'il pense de cela. Et il critique la recherche des causes finales précisément parce qu'elle détourne la science de son vrai objet. Ce sont les causes efficientes. La première cause... Alors quand vous parlez de cause formelle, il y a une cause formelle chez Bacon, puisque ce qu'on cherche, c'est une forme à la fin. Alors après, qu'est-ce qu'il appelle forme? C'est plutôt une super cause efficiente. Hein, mais c'est une cause, si vous la maîtrisez, cette cause formelle, vous pouvez transmuer n'importe quelle nature en n'importe quelle autre.
Mais est-ce que la recherche des causes efficientes serait encore, ou peut-être une spéculation vaine ou non?
Si elle se poursuit à l'infini, oui. Si vous cherchez, vous êtes arrivé à la forme, qui en réalité est une cause efficiente. Hein. Si vous cherchez encore la cause de ça, là, vous êtes dans une recherche vaine. Je pense que chez Hobbes, on retrouverait des choses un peu semblables quand il parle de Dieu. C'est une cause sans cause. Et l'idée même de chercher la cause à suivre, c'est pas du tout dans son champ lexical, en tout cas.
D'accord, merci.
One of the kinds of curiosity you distinguished, I think, was the sort of curiosity that takes as its object small private matters, what you called kind of nosy curiosity. And it does seem like that kind of curiosity is more generally laid at the door of women than of men, and thought perhaps to be more natural to them. But it seems like that sort of curiosity would be worth criticizing no matter who indulged in it. And I wondered if in your research you came across criticisms of men for this same kind of curiosity. That is, when we're looking at scientific curiosity, you see a pretty clear divide, a pretty clear gender divide. It's admirable in one and it's not admirable in another. But this sort of curiosity, nosiness, looks like it might not be admirable at all.
Yeah, thanks for... Thanks for the question. Yeah, I agree. And also in this case, Kenny makes the point that we have to kind of a bit differentiate the judgment by Blumenberg with his grand narrative about this positive attitude towards curiosity. That obviously there were different kinds of curiosity, and some kinds were always blameworthy, and we would maybe still agree today that there are. Kenny's point was to say, well, curiosity was sometimes negatively seen with regard to men, but sometimes positively when it comes to this scientific theoretical approach, but mostly and almost always negatively when it comes to women, so that the association with this nosy kind of curiosity with a woman is closer. This is actually, being a female this kind of curiosity is meant to be female, and this dictionary I cited, I think showed how deep this was rooted in societies, to show, well, this is a typical trait of the female character, to show this kind of blameworthy curiosity. So yeah, that's true. But I think what I wanted to show is that this background of this association made it difficult to claim curiosity in a positive way for women, or made it more difficult than for men, because there was this link with this negative thing. So they had to face this as well and to come over it. Yeah, but then when it comes to positive curiosity with regard to women, they were always reflecting on the scientific curiosity and never ever on the space one that is blameworthy. Yeah.
I have a question for Monsieur Gontier. I'm not, if you don't mind, I'll ask it in English.
Yes, sir, that's fine.
I'm no Bacon scholar, and I haven't read Blumenberg's big study, but curiosity is, as I understand it, often a marker for Epicureanism, in which I have an interest. Now, there are several indications that Bacon subscribed to Epicurean principles, the idea of the eternity of matter, the possibility of other worlds, and that he may have influenced Hobbes along these lines. The difficulty is that there really hasn't been any very good study of Epicureanism in terms of the circles that were discussing it, but there are all sorts of hints that the Libertin Érudits were discussing it, that the Great Hugh Circle was discussing it, that together with the impact of Galileo, people were discussing Epicurean views. Do you think that in Bacon, this interest in curiosity is an Epicurean marker?
I never thought about that. So, what do you mean by Epicurean marker for curiosity?
Well, you see, I'm very uncertain about this, but it does seem to be more and more the case from what studies are revealing that Epicureanism was seen, saw a revival after Galileo because it was a consistently worked out physics. And of course it became the physics of modernity. And the real question is how much people had already anticipated this. It couldn't be discussed openly because of the problem of heresy, but it seems that in all sorts of circles, people were discussing this possibility. And Bacon seems to be in the forefront, but this is only an impression I have because I'm not a Bacon scholar. But then the fact that Hobbes should have, I believed, subscribed very much to Epicurean principles makes me wonder, Hobbes was Bacon's amanuensis, if he was influenced by Bacon or if maybe this is over-schematizing it too much.
Well, I'm not sure I can answer now to your question. I don't know if you mean by Epicurean, I see for myself Epicurus himself or Lucretius. The interdiction of kind of knowledge that would give us only troubles and, you know, about God or things. Or if you mean, but it's not so far, the utilitarianism. And both things are quite Baconian, actually. So I remember that Leo Strauss said for Hobbes that he was a kind of Epicurean. I think you could say maybe the same until a certain point, anyway, for Bacon. But
well, Pachi and Paganini are the ones that have written most powerfully on Hobbes and Epicureanism. But no, it's the Epicureanism post the rediscovery of Lucretius. It's not necessarily ancient Epicureanism, but it did seem to produce a very coherent worldview that was an alternative to Aristotelianism.
okay, thank you.
So I'd like to ask some further information to Ms. Besmeyer. I was impressed when you mentioned on Anna Maria von Schurman because she was cited a couple times by Descartes in his letters to Father Mersenne in 1641. And Descartes says, "It is so sad that the intellectual talents of Ms. Schurman were damaged because of her curiosity, because she is so curious that she attended at some lectures proposed by some Dutch theologian like Voetius. So, and of course, he also mentioned on his brother. His brother is stupid. He is not curious at all. So I'm wondering if you have any further informations how these female figures' position on curiosity were received by any other.
Problems understanding the micros maybe a bit.
Shall I repeat from the first?
That's what we have. I'm sorry.
Sorry of my English, maybe.
No,
So-
no. I think it's just if you, I don't know.
Because English is not my mother language. So when you mentioned Maria von Schurman,
Yeah.
I was impressed because she was cited a couple times by Descartes in his letters to Father Mersenne in 1641. Do you understand?
Whose letters to Mersenne?
Descartes.
Descartes.
Yes.
Ah, Descartes to Mersenne. Okay, yeah.
1641, a couple times. And he says that it is sad to see that intellectual talents of Schurman were damaged because of her curiosity, because she is so curious to everything. So she attended at some lectures proposed by Dutch theologians like Voetius. So I'm wondering if you have any further informations how these females figures' position on curiosity were received by other male intellectuals of that time. Do you have any further information on that?
I see. No, I'm sorry. No, I can't provide you with these kind of informations. No, I think maybe we can talk later a bit on this topic, but I don't have any specific points to say here. Sorry.
Thanks.
Mais moi, je t'entends de toutes les façons. Mais... Ou...
Le statut des causes finales entre les deux est très très différent. Parce que pour Bacon, les causes finales existent, simplement l'homme ne peut pas les connaître, et ce serait une vaine curiosité d'essayer de chercher ces causes finales-là, tandis que pour Hobbes, même Dieu ne suit pas des causes finales. Son action ne se règle pas sur des causes finales. Il n'a pas de cause et d'autant plus, il n'a pas de fin à poursuivre. Hein. Et l'autre point qui me semble intéressant dans la comparaison entre Bacon et Hobbes, et qui touche en effet le point de la curiosité, plus explicitement chez Bacon et moins explicitement chez Hobbes. C'est justement l'interprétation du péché originel. Parce que pour Bacon, le péché d'Adam et Ève est un péché d'orgueil, une curiosité orgueilleuse, mais qui s'adresse à la nature. Tandis que dans le Léviathan, le péché d'Adam et d'Ève concerne le bien et le mal. Donc, c'est la curiosité pas seulement de connaître, mais d'établir le bien et le mal. Donc, c'est une curiosité qui s'adresse plutôt aux valeurs morales et surtout aux lois politiques dans le royaume naturel de Dieu. Donc tout cela change beaucoup, change beaucoup, parce que dans le cas de Bacon, il s'agit d'une curiosité qui s'adresse vers la nature, et dans le cas de Hobbes, il s'agit d'une curiosité qui s'adresse au monde des valeurs morales, encore une fois, des causes finales, finalement. Donc, je pose la deuxième question ou bien j'attends la réponse.
Je te remercie de cette question. Oui, alors j'essaie de répondre vite. Je suis tout à fait d'accord pour Dieu, mais je vois quand même deux choses. D'abord, fonctionnellement, on arrive au même résultat. On évacue les causes finales du champ de la recherche scientifique, que ce soit la recherche politique ou la recherche dans les sciences de la nature. Et la deuxième chose, c'est quand même la référence au scriptura sola qu'on trouve vraiment chez les deux. C'est-à-dire, la raison n'a rien à faire là où il y a l'écriture. Alors après que Hobbes soit ironique, moi je suis très pour la lecture de Léo Strauss, et qu'il démolisse au final même l'écriture, ça j'en suis assez d'accord, alors que chez Bacon on ne trouvera jamais ce type d'ironie. On n'est pas non plus... Après, sur la deuxième chose, là, je ne suis pas absolument sûr. Tu veux dire, la curiosité qui est condamnée par Bacon, elle ne porte pas sur la nature. La curiosité qui est condamnée, elle porte précisément sur le bien et le mal, la racine du bien et du mal, toutes ces choses sur lesquelles nous devrions nous contenter de suivre l'Écriture, parce que nous n'avons aucune idée de la volonté de Dieu. Et là où je crois qu'il y a beaucoup de différences, évidemment, puisque entre les deux, il y a la conversion de Hobbes à la science moderne, etc. Mais la dimension politique, je crois, change énormément les choses. Et étant le domaine ouvert par Bacon à un nouveau champ scientifique, encore une fois, Bacon, il est républicain dans son fond. Alors qu'on a souvent dit que Hobbes était le père des libéraux, en remettant ça dans un contexte tout à fait contemporain. Et je crois qu'il y a vraiment cette différence aussi, qu'ils ne vivent pas du tout dans le même contexte politique. Et ça doit changer beaucoup les translations.
Merci. The second question is not so much a question, but a commentary concerning the gendered interpretation of the original scene in the 17th century. Of course, I shall say a triviality, but there are also some interpretations that are not gendered. And I shall come back again to Hobbes, to this famous chapter of the Leviathan, I don't remember the number, where he tries to give an allegorical interpretation of the original scene. An allegorical interpretation, the key of which is basically a political key, and there is no specific difference between Adam and Eve. They are both equally guilty at the level of this kind of political scene.
Yeah, just a very short comment on the comment. So obviously my presentation is a very limited one, and there are other things. But I think it was not a minor threat that there was a gendered interpretation of this, because it comes already from Augustine, and he has various, I think, 3 commentaries on Genesis, and there is this famous quotation that he says, Adam and Eve, they sinned pari fasto, so same in their pride, but impari sexu, but not equal in their sex. And then all the commentary literature, they jumped on this all the time. Well, what does this mean? Why is it unequal? In what sense is it unequal? How does the gender has a play here? There are researches on this, and it has been shown that the very vast majority of the commentary tradition shows all the time that obviously Eve is more guilty, that this is meant by this. So there was a long tradition from Isidore Bonaventura Petrus Lombardos, Thomas Aquinas, everyone actually commenting on this, following this tradition. So it's great that it opened up in the early modern period, but there was this very strong tradition.
So you think that the main fault is to Augustine?
Well, no.
Augustinian increase
Maybe.
is unequal interpretation.
Well, he is not very explicit in what he intends to say with this. So it was up to the others. So they take up the ball and they made something out of it. So I wouldn't blame him.
Bien, on arrête là. Jenny. On arrête. Bon, attends, excuse-moi, l'organisateur du colloque tient beaucoup à ce que... on arrête là. Il y a encore beaucoup de questions sans doute, mais il me semble que le plus simple, c'est qu'on s'en tienne aux règles qu'avait posées Gianni Paganini et que les questions soient posées pendant l'intervalle aux orateurs. Que nous applaudissons.
Questo non è Ciliberto, questo